In this session, we will discuss Ontario's wine history post-Prohibition and the era of government control and regulation initiated during that time and which remains in force today. Canada after Prohibition. Was it better or worse? As you recall, during Prohibition, wine was still legally made and sold, but the purchaser or the customer had to purchase at least 5 gallons of wine at a time. This led to an increase in production, an increase in the number of wineries, and ultimately the increase in sales, somewhat ironically. Now that Prohibition has been lifted, all other forms of alcohol can also be sold. What will this do to Ontario's wine industry? When Prohibition was repealed in 1927, the first thing the government did was to place a moratorium on issuing new winery licenses. That means that between 1927 and 1974, the number of wineries in Ontario decreased from 61 to just 6. It happened very rapidly. By sometime in the 1930s, the number was already down to 8, believe it or not. Because a winery was only permitted to have one wine retail license and no new wineries were permitted to open, it was a huge opportunity for the bigger wineries to take over the smaller wineries in order to increase their retail space and opportunities to corner the market. Consolidation was indeed the order of business during this period. In the early days of Prohibition in 1921 20 to 21, there were almost 1 million litres of Ontario wine being made. By 1930 to 31, 10 years later, there was an increase of 10 times, 9 million litres being made. These wines were called block and tackle wines, about 80% of which were sweet red Concord wines fortified to 20% and sold at the base price or the floor price that the LCBO set. When Prohibition was lifted, the Scandinavian design for operating a liquor control system was adopted. It was called the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, of course. And the idea was the neo-prohibitionists would be happy because the government was controlling and limiting the sale, production, and distribution of alcohol. The government would be happy because this was a huge revenue-making or money-making opportunity. And the producers should be happy because they're producing wine again in a more open market and with only one big buyer to deal with. Conservative Howard Ferguson lobbied for the Liquor Control Act of 1927 and subsequently won his election. The purpose of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario was to, quote, promote temperance, sobriety, personal liberty, and above all, to restore respect for the law, unquote. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario monitored the purchases of all individuals and businesses. They also created what we called an interdiction list, which essentially was a list that included the names of people who had broken the law, consumed too much, consumed it in the wrong manner, shouldn't be allowed to purchase alcohol, etc., etc., etc. And by 1957, this last list had over 120,000 people named on it. The interdiction list permitted the LCBO vendors to refuse the sale of liquor, revoke licenses, and to contact the police. Unfortunately, the list, although some thought it was a good idea, was generally biased against First Nations, poor, and women. The LCBO in those days. One was required to purchase a permit to purchase alcohol. The purchases were recorded in a passbook. It looked like a passport, and it recorded every alcoholic beverage that an individual purchased. At that time, in 1957, for example, an order form was filled out and stock was retrieved by an LCBO employee because customers were not permitted to touch alcoholic beverages in the store themselves, but instead filled out this order form, and the LCBO employee retrieved the products from a hidden storage area. The products were bagged discreetly in brown paper, and the customer was then permitted to pay for his purchase and leave. It seems very much like the situation one encounters when you have to purchase a prescription at your local pharmacy, although the purchase of beverage alcohol somehow feels far more shady given these situations. It wasn't until 1969 that one could enter an LCBO store and actually pick up their own products and bring them to the cashier. And this, of course, is the system we have in use today. Let's look at some of the documents that we've just referred to. The first is the permit application. This is from 1929, and as you can see, it's a rather official-looking document. Only a $2 charge to get this permit, but remember, in the Depression, in 1929, $2 was significantly more valuable than what we might perceive it to be today. Once you had your liquor permit, then you could be given a permit passport. This is from 1933. Looks a little bit like a passport, quite an official document with a serial number, etc. Let's look inside. Turn to the front of the passbook and we see the application for individual liquor permit, officially signed by all of the government officials with the name and details of the particular customer. Turn further and we see the areas where the purchases can be recorded with the date, the quantities of beer, spirits, or wine that have been purchased, their value, the store number where the purchase took place, and the initials of the vendor who sold the beverage alcohol to the individual. Here we have a copy of a Liquor Control Board of Ontario order form from 1955, and again, you can see that the brand number is filled out by the customer, the number of bottles they wish to purchase, the kind of liquor that they are purchasing. In this case, it's hard to make out, but looks like it might be a wine from 1958. Although, to be honest, that would be surprising if this is in fact a form from 1955. The price was $3.20, and the total amount that was to be charged then was $3.20. The permit number was allocated, etc., etc. Here we see a copy of an interdiction notice. The interdiction notice was a letter prepared by the LCBO and sent to stores prohibiting the sale, service, or supply of intoxicating liquor to anyone named in the letter. And the letter was valid for a period of 12 months. In 1947, the Liquor Licensing Board of Ontario, or LLBO, was formed. Its role was to start controlling the sales of liquor by licensed establishments. Women were not permitted to drink alone, only with unmarried male or bona fide escorts, and they had to do so in a special ladies' and escorts room. The LLBO also controlled singing, dancing, and swearing in liquor establishments. Although the government was making lots and lots of money in this day, there were problems. The government was happy with the revenue. However, low quality, fraud, and outright dangerous products were being made as producers tried to maximize their earnings, sometimes with unscrupulous actions or shoddy production methods. It seemed it was time to start controlling something else, the production and standards for production of beverage alcohol. And so quickly, the government began developing laboratories to test all products that were to be sold in their stores. One early change was to initiate a maximum threshold for volatile acidity at 4 grams per liter. For your information, today's limit is 1.3 grams per liter for a red wine, and believe it or not, that's still too high, as the wine still smells and tastes like vinegar. These laboratories also eliminated the sale of high alcohol medicinal products like the Bronfman Empire's lucrative Dandy Bracer liver and kidney cure. The LCBO also put a limit on alcohol in wine. The maximum permitted alcohol for any wine product was 20% alcohol by volume, and this is still in effect today. The Ministry of Health went further and opened a school for winemakers. This school was a 2-year program designed to train those that wanted to specialize in sanitary handling and sanitary premises. In other words, it was less about making quality wines and more about sanitation and health. A wine standards committee was formed within the LCBO back in 1933 to bring about improvements in wine. Let's revisit this idea of consolidation. Among other entrepreneurs, Harry Hatch of T.G. Bright and Company was one that quickly bought wineries up. Why, you might ask, was he so anxious to buy up so many wineries? Well, to start, believe it or not, the average price for a floundering small winery during the Depression was a mere $7,500. But let's be clear, it wasn't about the wine. That was sent for distillation. It did, however, reduce the competition, the classic reason for consolidation. And each winery license had only one retail store. So for every winery you purchased, you increased your winery retail space by one full store, thus giving you a huge advantage over smaller wineries or individual wineries. We called this Harry's buying spree. With each retail license, they could increase the margin that they kept selling, rather than selling to the LCBO, who took a fairly big chunk of the final retail price and kept it for themselves. These retail licenses became valuable assets, and they still are today. We talk about the grandfathering of these licenses. Some of the wineries with lineage that go back to these old days still have these licenses that they may operate as a number of their own private stores, which creates a bit of an unfair playing field for new wineries and remains a point of contention today. Clearly, the hangover from Prohibition days and mistakes made then are still causing us some troubles today. In addition to being a skilled businessman, Harry Hatch was another thing. He was a visionary. In the 1930s, he hired a French chemist named Adhemar de Chaunac. De Chaunac quickly became respected by Harry Hatch and pushed the ideal of bringing quality up. At first, de Chaunac used some of the better Labrusca varieties like Duchess, Delaware, and Catawba to make lighter, fresher, and more fruit-forward wines. But he did so much more. In 1937, de Chaunac visited France, but he was also working with colleagues in the Finger Lakes and with plant breeders at the HRIO, or Horticultural Research Institute of Ontario, which is in Vineland, to make improvements to grape growing and wine quality. When he returned from France, he brought back French hybrids, and he began to plant new vineyards and experiment with these new varieties. This was of paramount importance and went a long way to pushing the overall quality of Ontario wines way up. During World War II, in 1942, the Prime Minister of the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, had a 30-minute address on national radio. Wine producers could produce only 80% of what they had produced in 1939 with no increases, and he also increased taxes on alcohol. Mackenzie King was making it very clear that it was not patriotic to imbibe while the boys were at war, and this period of time during the war essentially put the wine industry on hold. Visit the CBC archive for more details. Immediately post-World War II, de Chonac and others went right back to work. In the area between Lake Ontario and the Niagara Escarpment, Bright's company tore out Concord and planted over 600 acres of experimental varieties, including hybrids, by 1952. De Chonac also eventually brought a number of vinifera varieties, or the official wine species of grapevine, including Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Gamay, Riesling, and others, to the Ontario wine scene. This predates any of the work with vinifera planting being done in the USA by the earliest pioneer there, Dr. Constantine Frank. In fact, by 1955, Bright's had bottled the first commercial bottling of Chardonnay to ever have been produced in Canada. And so you ask yourself, why didn't Chardonnay take off at that time in the mid-1950s? What took so long for it to become such a popular grape variety in Ontario? Well, in the vineyard, it required incredible babying just to keep the precious and sensitive vines alive. Even after all this attention, the vines were averaging a mere 1 tons per acre, hardly the kind of volume to make vinifera the vine of the future. So, other hybrids that were being used in these experimental vineyards included Maréchal Foch, which remains in small quantities in Ontario today, Cibelle 9549, Baco Noir, which of course is a fairly popular red hybrid in the Ontario wine industry, Chelois, Céval, and others. These hybrids produce decent wines with less of the overt, foxy character that the indigenous vine species were producing. Interestingly, in 1961, Adhemar de Chonac retired, but hybrids and vinifera were the order of the day in Ontario vineyards by the time he did. Cibelle 9549 was renamed de Chonac as an honor to de Chonac. Interestingly, it happened to be his least favorite variety. Ah yes, and then came the ducks, and the bears, and the geese. Visit this CBC digital archive for more information on Baby Duck and its zoo of competition wines. Andres produced 2 products originally in the between the 1950s and 1970s. Andres had products called Cold Duck and Chanté. Bright's first launched their first product in 1952, and it was called Winette, and as you can see in this image, was sold in a pop bottle, ideally to make it more popular to a wider audience. These wines were sparkling, they were sweet, and they had low levels of alcohol, only 7%, and thus were called pop wines. Baby Duck became the king of the pop wines as it was launched in 1971. It would go on to sell 60 million cases by 1980. There were many others who entered the market, all with references to cute, playful creatures, Fuddle Duck, Love-a-Duck, Baby Bear, Baby Deer, etc. Makes one wonder if the Australians and other nations took a page from Ontario's book with their litter of critter wines that were introduced to the world market in the 1980s. Wines like Yellowtail, Little Penguin, and others, which remain on LCBO shelves today. The genius of this style of wine was that the wines were literally diluted basic wines, sweetened to 50 or 55 grams per liter of residual sugar, and then injected with CO2 just to make them appealing like pop. Was one of the goals to start expanding the audience for these wines? Was the idea to make wines seem like pop, and perhaps the younger wine drinkers will take notice? and swap their beer for wine. There was a great deal of slick marketing that had been used in England as the test mark in 1970, just as Mateus Rosé, the popular off-dry rosé from Portugal, had done years earlier. There was an awful lot of slick marketing, great advertisements, and it was very successful until the 1980s. Cheap, fortified wines called port and sherry at the time, in most cases still ruled the sales well into the 1970s, with over 40% of the Ontario wines sold. Clearly, people were interested in higher levels of alcohol, regardless of the ultimate overall quality of the wine. Thank goodness for 1974, as it was the beginning of the modern Ontario wine industry. After much consultation and meetings with government officials, who were at first not interested in the least in changing anything, Donald Zeraldo and his Austrian partner and winemaker, Karl Kaiser, were granted the first winery license for a new Ontario winery, Inniskillen, near Niagara-on-the-Lake. In the years that followed, many brave and capable entrepreneurs followed, with Karl Podemer opening Podemer Champagne 24 days after Inniskillen, Alan Eastman at Chirale in 1977, the Bosque family at Chateau des Charmes in 1977, and Colio on Lake Erie North Shore in 1980.